There aren't any hard and fast rules when it comes to average product life cycles in the auto industry, but they tend to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 8 years. And that's when a brand will either kill off a vehicle entirely, replace it with something new, or release a redesigned version. And it's usually some combination of slowing sales, aging technology, or a much more modern competitive set that will help guide the decision-making process. Now, in the case of the Durango, Dodge has blown past that typical best before date with a model that's now in its 15th year on the market, mostly unchanged. Now, that age does come with some serious pros and cons, and we'll get to a whole bunch of them here, but there's no denying what the Durango still gets right all these years later. For more expert car reviews, don't forget to share our channel and subscribe so you can catch some of this and maybe even a little of that. I happen to think the third-gen Durango looks better today than it did back when it came out in 2011. And yes, there have been some styling updates over the years, but don't forget the overall shape and proportions. They are the same as they were on day one. And that brings us to the Durango's size, which happens to be one of its biggest advantages. Now, it's smaller than something like the Chevrolet Tahoe that's built on a body-on-frame platform like a pickup truck. But if you're cross-shopping it against the Chevy Traverse or the Toyota Grand Highlander, it has some distinct advantages, starting with the fact that even a V6 powered version like this one is rated to tow 6,200 pounds, which is more than just about anything else like it. Yes, the Nissan Pathfinder gets close at 6,000 pounds, and the Jeep Grand Cherokee, that's newer than this, although closely related, is rated to pull the same 6,200 pounds, but here is where the Durango has its edge. It is still offered with a V8 under the hood that bumps that number up by 1,000 pounds, and if you go with a tow package or one of the SRT versions, it jumps to 8,700 pounds thanks to some upgraded brakes and other goodies. And anyways, one of my favorite features here is a pretty simple one. The fact that the hitch is hidden behind this panel on the bumper, which keeps the styling nice and clean when you don't have a trailer hooked up to the back. But here is a sign of the Durango's age you probably weren't expecting. Just how painfully slow this power tailgate is to open and close. Look, I know that might seem like a bit of a cheap shot, but I'm telling you, that tailgate takes an awful lot of patience to deal with. And it takes about as long to open as a more modern tailgate would take to open and close. It's the sort of thing that's going to matter if you value modern amenities. And here's another sign of the Durango's age, although some of you out there may appreciate it. It has a mechanical parking brake. You do not see these very often these days. Yes, they are much more simple than an electronic system, but the trade-off, there is no automatic vehicle hold that you get with vehicles with electronic parking brakes. And some of you may not be familiar with what that means, but it basically is that you can bring the vehicle to a stop at a red light, let your foot off the brake, and it will keep the brakes held and the brake lights on so the driver behind you knows that you're still stopped, and you can give your foot a rest. It is a nice feature. It's something that I use all the time, and I'm just not so sure I would want to buy a vehicle in the year 2026 that doesn't have that feature. And then here's another one, the low resolution of this backup camera. It is just unacceptable in this day and age. It should be much better. And another nod to this vehicle's age, just how thick these A-pillars that frame the windshield are. Because more modern vehicles, well, they tend to use more high-strength steel, and that means they don't have to be as chunky, so they will not obstruct your outward visibility. These are a little bit problematic, something to keep note of. Now, aside from that stuff, I would say the Durango's cabin is where it shows its age the most. But again, it's a mixed bag of good and bad, because I am very happy to see that this thing wasn't swept up in the tidal wave of touch integration that just overwhelmed the industry after this thing came out. And yeah, you can still, I don't know, manage the climate control through the touchscreen if you want, but you get a whole bunch of redundant physical controls that are much easier to use, especially at a passing glance. And you can do stuff like adjust your heated or ventilated seats, your steering wheel, the temperature zones, the fan speed, all that good stuff with these controls down here. There's also some drive related functions as well. It is very nice to see. And then the touchscreen itself, well, it runs Uconnect 5, which is pretty fantastic. It works a lot like a smartphone. It's bright, it's responsive, and it has wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which does help modernize the space at least a little bit. But overall, you can really tell that this is a vehicle that came out 15 years ago, just based on some of the shapes, the plastics, all of that stuff. Yeah, okay, it looks a little bit more modern than it did in 2011. This refresh dates back to something like 2015, but still, that makes this a very old cabin. And when you look at some of the more modern entries in the segment, like the Chevy Traverse, like the Hyundai Palisade, like the Kia Telluride, those have a lot of wow factor that this one is missing. Oh, and just jumping back to the subject of towing for a quick second, with all the equipment that you can get with the Durango, there is an integrated trailer brake controller, which you do not often see in mid-size SUVs like this one. So you can really take advantage of all that capacity, and you can really take advantage of all the space in here. There is a whole lot of room. Yes, something like the Tahoe is bigger, but as far as these unibody mid-size SUVs go, this is about as spacious as they come. And something I really do like is the fact that the third row seat, it is not bolted directly to the floor. Not only can it fit my 6'4" frame fairly comfortably, but it means that my knees aren't up at my chin when I sit back there, and that is great for family life. The second row has all kinds of room, and there's a good amount of cargo space too. The second and third row seats fold flat, so you can take advantage of all of that. But if you want to shuttle your family around, there is plenty of space for you to do so. And it's fairly comfortable and quiet in here overall. The ride quality, yeah, it's reasonable on some of these rougher roads. It can get a little bit overwhelmed. This one I'm driving rides on 20-inch wheels. They are very big and heavy, and you can really feel them kind of pulling at the suspension on really rough surfaces, but it is totally manageable, and so is the drive itself. Although I would say this thing definitely handles about as big as it looks. That doesn't mean it's unruly out on the road, but something to keep in mind. The turning circle is wider than most vehicles this size, another sign of its age. And that matters in parking lot situations. You are going to need just a little bit of extra room, especially if you're coming from a more modern SUV than this one. And look, I haven't even got to what's under the hood, which, like I mentioned earlier, is a V6. It's the 3.6 liter Pentastar that Chrysler, Dodge, all of those brands have been using for a very long time, and it's still a rock solid option. In this case, it makes 295 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque, which might not seem like a lot, but it is more than ample in an application like this one. And it means even at cruising speed, if you drop the hammer, it goes pretty good. I am impressed with how this thing accelerates. It works reasonably well with this 8-speed automatic transmission and the standard all-wheel drive that we get in Canada, although there is a note about that system. With the V6, it is locked in a 50-50 split. There is no variability at all. It's a single-speed transfer case. It's just not a very complex system. So if you want some variability, if you want to be able to have a little bit more rearward torque, especially if you're towing, I don't know, if you're launching a boat or something, and you want to have that extra power and that extra traction in the back when you're on that boat ramp, well, you might want to go with the V8, not just for the extra power that comes with it, but with that fancier all-wheel drive system. Personally, I think this one is perfectly fine. It's full-time in nature, which means you always have four-wheel traction, and that is very helpful in Canadian conditions, but it's something to note that it's just a very basic system overall. But hey, on that note, fuel consumption isn't that bad. I mean, yeah, it does burn a lot of gas. It's a V6, it's full-time all-wheel drive, but it's still pretty competitive in the segment. Now, officially, it's rated to burn 11.9 liters per 100 kilometers combined, which doesn't sound all that impressive, mostly because it's not. But if you take a look at something like that Chevy Traverse that I brought up earlier, it's very similar in size to this, but with the most recent version that was introduced just a couple years ago, Chevy went with a downsized turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, but it's rated for 11.4 liters per 100 kilometers combined. And the Hyundai Palisade that uses a V6, that's right about the same. I think it's 11.9. So it shows you that even though this is an old engine in an old platform, it can still keep up with most of the competition. And even this week, with a little bit more highway driving, I had that number down in the mid-10s. Now, around town, that's where this thing is going to suffer the most, so it's something to keep in mind if you're using this to shuttle the kids to school and back, and you aren't really getting out on the highway all that often. I wouldn't be surprised if you end up with numbers closer to the mid-teens, which is pretty awful, and that means you might want to look at a hybrid from one of the competitor products out there. But again, if you want that pulling power, this really does deliver something that is hard to find in the segment. It really does seem like Dodge has zeroed in on that as the Durango's mission, and it is sticking to it all these years later. Now, of course, I guess I should point out that the V8, of course, burns even more gas than this, and the non-performance version, that thing's rated for something like 14.3. So again, if you're just driving around town, it is going to burn even more gas than this one. So I guess that makes this the efficient option. Anyways, it is time to talk pricing. And the big question remains, how much should you reasonably expect to pay for a 15-year-old SUV? I don't know, but this thing kind of seems like a license to print money for Dodge, considering its age. I can't imagine that it owes Dodge anything at this point. Everything that's been invested has surely been recouped by now, and that means that all of this is just pure profit, and there is a lot to be made. And look, I'm not advocating for Dodge to be giving the Durango away, but this one I'm driving is stickered at about 73 grand before tax. And of course, it's easy to spend even more than that if you go with the V8. I'm not even talking about one of the SRT versions, just one of these GT, I don't know, pluses with the Hemi under the hood. It gets even more expensive. But then there is a big caveat, and that is the fact that Dodge and its sister brands, well, they are very happy to slap incentives on the hood that lower the price. And as of this recording, the brand is offering something like $8,500 off one exactly like this here in Canada, which makes the price tag a lot more competitive. But the flip side to that is that by the time you're watching this, well, that extra bonus money off might be off the table, and that means paying full pop for something that's 15 years old and looks it and feels it in just about every way possible. To recap, I like how well the Durango's looks are aging, all the pulling power it has, and the simple physical controls inside. I don't like the poor camera quality, the painfully slow power tailgate, or the outdated look and feel of the cabin. No matter the price, what you're paying for here is an SUV that came out in 2011, and it shows in some ways that are more tolerable than others. At the end of the day, it's up to you to decide whether the good outweighs the bad and how much you're willing to pay considering those compromises.